advancing very quickly with our International Insurance Convention. And the topic that follows is a very relevant one. Why? Because we question ourselves if after the sanitation crisis and the consequent lockdown, what lessons learned are left in the consumers? Will the world be more aware and responsible? What changes should the sectors consider to come closer to the new and undecipherable consumer? To solve all these questions, we invite our next panel member, Camilo Herrera, director of the Radar firm, and his analysis, consumer analysis after the pandemic. Camilo, good morning and welcome. Good morning and greetings to all of you present in such an important event. I want to thank Dr. Miguel Gomez for this invitation, Ingrid and all your team for making this a reality, and for giving me the opportunity to somehow be the voice of the Colombian consumers in terms of what has happened and what can happen to them from here onward. To give an extent, this presentation I have here is about the technical side behind a book that thankfully La Planeta editors released to the market a short while ago, talking about the question you mentioned. How much did consumers change during this period, and what are we expecting regarding what's happening? So the information presented here mostly gathers information until 31 August of this year. And this is worthwhile saying, thinking that every day there's new information coming in, like the superintendent said. And now 30 days has become a huge period with great variability. And maybe next week we can update September's data, and some of this information will change, but we don't think in a radical way. So the first thing that we have to analyze, thinking of today's consumer, is first that, of course, a great deal of the population will get this disease. It's something that will not disappear from our daily lives. Secondly, that the recovery in the level of expenditure of each household is going to take about 2 years, which shows us not just the importance of the demand in the global of the Colombian economy, but how hard it is to adjust such changes. Now, and thirdly, even if the superintendent talked about this, there's not going to be really deep changes in the social systems and the big social issues that humanity is facing generally because of this pandemic only. And we generated a civilization, that comes from has a certain of premises and very important situations. And in 200 past years, the world has consolidated on globalization. We're mostly finishing the 20th century. It's more visible, but it talks about new ways of exchange and interaction between nations and individuals. But now, coming into the 21st century, we see a new situation, which is mobilization, where you can connect, and the consumer can connect, and his mother and his wife can connect and learn things about any civilization, and getting to know about any culture, make a purchase in any country around the world. And this radically changes the situation, especially with mobile phones coming in, that let us somehow be nomads again, but entirely connected with the world, which is a dimension we had never engaged in priorly as human beings. But this virus now in our daily lives gives us, immobilization. We are not able to mobilize, and with a certain level of inertia, we start reviewing some of these common trends. So I want to share some figures that I'm sure, will agree with, even if you don't know them. First, 97% of people around the world is dressed. 75% of people around the world right now is awake, but only 42% of them are connected. And that's one of the most complex realities we have. So effectively, we have achieved that important products such as clothing, which is perhaps one of the oldest things used by humanity, covers the whole planet. But now connectivity is one of the greatest barriers that the consumer has in today's world. Even if you see social networks and emails and even chats, we have different behaviors than the one we can have face to face. It's also worth mentioning that not all of society, not all of humanity is connected. And evidently that causes huge differences at the time of being able to interact in these situations of isolation we currently find ourselves with. So we dream of traveling again, of visiting culture around the world, but we are seeing more and more in people's behavior, in particular in Latin America, is an expression of strong emotions, and I mean positive as well as negative emotions, through social networks that ended up being that little window that lets us go into a world where I said behavior is different, but that lets us express ourselves perhaps a bit more freely and with very little accountability, sadly. And having said that, I want to review figures of what happened to the Colombian economy. You've seen some of this, I'm sure, but I want to give them a different outlook from the point of view of the expenditure of households. Colombia had the largest fall in this third quarter of 2020, being the fourth big affectation we've seen in the last 35 years. We had the big mortgage crisis, where the financial crisis played a very important role, the world financial crisis, and then the drop in the price of commodities. And we've had different elements that have held back the Colombian economy, but we can clearly distinguish how the industry is much more sensitive to this dynamics and when the economy is falling, because this has much more components than the industry, like the construction sector is much more volatile when these elements are holding them back. And this is not as predictable, since it's much more nomadic, if you will, and depends on the conditions of the demand that are changing continuously. Then general trade and commerce, because this should serve both sectors, the industry as well as intermediate consumption and final consumption. It's not that we're in a homogeneous behavior. The household expense for new products isn't either. And if we look at the household expenditure, we can see the normal things that you buy every month in your household. And where you have other variables, you still see the growth of expense in households. Thinking of the historical values that have always been traditionally subject to insurance companies or to insurance possibilities, where we have seen the most aggressive dynamics taking place in. But this plays one thing that I want to show here, that durable goods had a biggest fall, right, in consumption than in the mortgage crisis. So this gives us a fundamental conclusion. The Colombian environment is changing systematically, and the possibility of having access to credit or to insurance has improved in such a way that the conditions about the decision making is very different. Where do we see this? In the service industry, today's services are 56% of the expense of Colombian households. And for the first time, services or utilities have dropped a lot. And this, of course, is because not utilities, but services. If we stay at home, we can't go to the movies, we can't go to a restaurant, we can't go to consume all these services. So what's happened so far, and this is information from the DANI, the Statistics Agency of Colombia, to understand what my mom's impacts are being. If she has a very hard drop in her income, and then in the service consumption, and amidst this is the expense structure of households. And it's all not expensive save. All that I told you about, these durable ones I mentioned have the trend, but the semi-durable ones have a very strong contraction per capita. So going back to 2008 levels, the durables are much more sensitive, that as an industry, and have a lot to do with the placement of policies that you issue. And of course, you also see a very strong drawback in the expense structure, but associated not just to the isolation, but evidently to the type of exchange rate and modifying the capacity factors of the purchase capacity of each household. And this consumption of services has really changed. So what have we learned so far? From the macroeconomic household expenses, about 70% of the Colombian economy today, and where in some years it's been able to maintain, the economy has maintained its growth. You can see in the graph on top, especially in the gray colored bars, evidencing how internal demand has maintained the economy. Of course, and sometimes it hasn't, but for the first time, like you see in the lower bars, that drawback in the service consumption is going to big differential factor right now. So we need these services to be insured more and more. A risk analysis element that needs to very adequately pinpoint, like the superintendent and the chairman said, because somehow the expense of households needs to be more and more about services and not products, really. So what do we know from this knowledge so far? Unfortunately, about what's happened and been published so far in Latin America. We have big important effects such as Brazil, just like Chile, just like Colombia, not at the Peruvian levels, and not in the compared to the Uruguay, very moderate drop. So this is at a consumption level. Also, Colombia is on top of or over the average for Latin America. And what I would highlight is that we've been a country that's been able to maintain public spending. So not everything falls on the internal consumption and finally the consumption of households, which somehow lets us be able to show that we're not just doing our homework as a society of containing the economic impacts from this situation, but there's an evident collective effort so that these particular effects on the households are not as bad as they could be. So when we talked about the GDP and the drop of GDP as well as the consumption of services in the region, we can evidence that we expect a big drop of Latin American economies this year, and we expect a general growth next year. Same thing happens for ordinary households. So the graph on top is GDP. That is talking about the International Monetary Fund. The table underneath is just an analysis we do in radar to see how the internal consumption is going to behave. And this is very important for you to somehow be able to, understand the magnitude of the situation. What these calculations tell us, I insist in the word calculations because the data is changing greatly. If we saw in 2020 100 boxes of whatever product in the Colombian market, in 2020 we're going to sell 94.4, and in 2021 we're only going to sell 97.9, which gives us in a very immediate context saying that that drop in household consumption, to talk about the macro and then the micro, tells us that we will recover in recovering the same size of the market regardless of population growth that's not only taking place on a normal and a vegetative basis, but also affected by the immigration from other countries, in particular Venezuela. So when we look at this data per capita to see this impact and understand it, somehow, so that grow in population demand, we see how, in general, all the per capita consumption will be held back in 2020 and with a slow recovery in 2021. And it's very few countries that will really recover its consumption levels of 2019. And the big generality, even and looking at the average of Latin America and the US, will not be able to recover these levels. So facing these adjustments, households have understood and are already aware that this is going to be a long haul to be able to recover themselves. And very surely you understand, but I'd like to put a couple of comments to these remarks. And I say the following: Colombia has two big labor challenges that we knew that since the beginning of this, the lockdown would affect the households. First, very high informal job rates that makes people required to go out on the street to be able to obtain the regular income, and that understanding that 72% of Colombia was able to or would be able to work from home, which is a figure that is being reviewed. So we would not be able to comply with these lockdowns, especially in certain regions, especially because of the heat in some places in Latin America. And we anticipated, in all models anticipated around the disease, that we would have one of the highest contagion and spread of the disease rates around the world. And today, and I think it's understood by mass media and has been portrayed that Latin America is one of the biggest places where the spread of the disease is taking place and the level of disease is greatest. So we are not very judicious complying the regulations that were laid out. And taking the comment by the superintendent and that he presented 2 months ago, evidently the government has injected very significant levels, of liquidity into the financial system so that it can respond to necessities that it's facing. So that compared to the crisis of 1998, 1999, where evidently the financial superintendents had a huge role to play in a world financial crisis, and more recently, the fall of the price of petrol and commodities in 2015, 2016, that prepared us to a certain extent to a situation like the one we're facing, leaving us with one of the best coverage situation scenarios that we could have had before the pandemic. And I want to make a halt here because facing the situation, the Colombian state decided on something. We will defend employment, or formal employment, I should say, in the best way we can. We can try and build the most from the capillarity of all this analysis, send the best support that we can to Colombian households. And the informal sector will be defended through credit, and the entrepreneurial sector will be defended through credit and other financing mechanisms. Now, of course, these systems are not connected with a credit system. This one is not connected with a taxative system, and this one is not connected with a financial system. And that was clear that we had some difficulties there, as it's evident that there's some households that are increasing its income levels, as some households are really facing hardship, as the DANE has showed us in its social outcome statistics survey, where this is a very important line. But thinking about this, the government was able to protect, to a great extent, the capacity of acquiring goods of the Colombian, not of income, but of acquiring goods. And this is interesting, as well as mortgage credits and consumption credits and the role they have played out so far. Until yesterday, and now from October, people and households need to pay their credits in an ordinary way, and specific exemptions or delay periods that were allowed in payment credits and that gives us awareness of understanding now what's the collections of the banks and financial entities looking back and their capacity to collect this debt. And I show you this cartoon that I've been using for over 3 months in different presentations I've had a good fortune of being able to attend. And today it's actually a homage to Martín Salvador Cavado, or known as Kino, which is the artist of this cartoon, which with his sobriety very quickly lets us understand situations that are sometimes hard to talk about. So now with the analysis, not from the economic standpoint, but from the marketing side, if you will. In Colombia, we have different behaviors. Where in January we have 2 holidays, we have 31 days. Almost all of the educational sector is on vacation. You have the big chill seasons where the chills can damage some of our harvest. All this inflation takes place in a single month. You pay a lot of the taxes that were caused the previous year, and households don't receive money since 22 December pretty much. Since there's salary forward payments before your vacation leave on December, and each month is entirely different in Colombia. And understanding this cycle of expenditure in each Colombian household, where we can conclude that in each month we spend a little bit more, where in Mother's Day we spend 3% more, when if it's in June, July, when the school season is starting, we're going to spend a bunch more. And there's different holidays that will make us spend more. And from the sociological and anthropological point of view, but I also say this, from my point of view of how, not judicious we are as Colombians. From there on, the August promotions and sales, Friends Day, then holidays, Halloween, and then the big holidays in December and Christmas and such that increase expense so much. But there's also very low other months that concentration of payment of income tax or real estate tax takes place on these months. And the big lockdown that is the way it's called in the world, takes place in Colombia in the moment where there's less expenditure in households. But the second phase takes June and July, or July and August, that are very important in the total of the expense in our market. Now, fortunately, the figures published by the Danish Statistics Agency talks about important recovery in the market, which has a dynamic and affects the household consumption. So in March, when we got to know about the lockdown, we did some moderating factors telling us that if one person spends a million pesos per month distributed in these eight elements, and you can see in the slides later on when you can look at these closely, we had a behavior before the lockdown, like in a bunker preparation phase where you start preparing for this ice age that was about to come, or this effect of trying to stock up. And you see a reduction in households where the first item is in shopping goods, because you shopped so much previous months. Then the incapacity to purchase certain services and categories, like going to the movies, you can't do that anymore. And thirdly, the level of income that the households had. And that's why I mentioned informality as a big factor here, where so many job positions are informal in Colombia. And then when we stabilize ourselves a bit more, we need to have and understand this completely different expenditure structure than before the pandemic, which I think is the most important thing that what most analysts were talking about and trying to anticipate. So if I ask you, not as people from the financial sector or experts in insurance, but if I ask you as a consumer instead, if you had the possibility of buying something else right now, what would you buy? Very surely you would tell me you want to buy a book, that you want to buy a watch, that you want to buy travel and go someplace. If the question was opposite, if you said, what would you like not to have to buy? That answer is not so easy. It's not about desire. It's talking about your frustration. And it's what happened to many households. 80% of expense took place outside the household and 20% inside. Now, being isolated, you have two phenomena taking place. The first, we started making more a non-face-to-face purchase where 50 or 60% is over the phone. And a small portion, that 17.2 that you see on the graph, are things that we were not able to obtain that we could before, like taking a cab or ride the subway or an airplane, go to a bar, to a concert, whatever you did for leisure as well. And as the lockdown increased and isolation increased, we have two things. First, you reorganize the expense of the house and the regular basket of goods obtained. But this was not a natural transformation, but before the necessity of not being able to go out and the limitations that we had as well. So the change in the structure of household expense has been very important, and understanding it is more and more relevant every day, because households are entirely reallocating as a function of lower income, like it was job affectation when you get laid off. And then talking about the new necessities, that is what I want to talk about, where the fashion industry and clothes and apparel, of course, had a significant drop, as well as entertainment. But categories such as health, education, and food have had very important growth, not just in volume, but talking about the preference and composition or breakdown of that expense in each household. And every house went through four stages. First, trying to stock up, like make your house a bunker before this ice age or war, or similar to this, where we brought masks and alcohol and liquid gel and bananas. I don't know. I just use bananas as an example. Then on the second phase of adapting to a new reality, we realized that our home was not prepared for us to stay and remain so much time there. And we understand that we live in a hotel room, really, and it's a hotel room that's not the most comfortable one to stay in. That has very important shortfalls, where we live between 30 and 80 meters squared in Colombia very frequently, with a pet very frequently. And we need to now start working virtually, coexist as a family all the time, and try to find times for intimacy and being alone as well, which is a big challenge as well. So facing all of this, we started buying computers, because only 45% of homes in Colombia had a computer, despite 60% of households having connectivity. So to be able to attend your Zoom meeting or your kid being able to go to school virtually, we needed more computers. That was a big boom in items such as this, where we didn't see the same response or equated to, similar response to compensate for this from the insurance sector to balance this out. Also, exposure is higher and higher, and this adds to a series of buying of furniture. For example, people bought more office chairs, more cameras and such, and then to adapt your living room that is no longer used as such, but as a classroom for your child, perhaps, or as an office, temporary office space for you, and a series of things that we had to reassign. And I go back to the bananas. At the 10th day of eating bananas every day, you say, I'm tired of eating bananas, and the other bananas that I bought started getting spoiled because I bought too many of them. So in reality, I had to adjust my purchase basket of goods, including food. And then you see big purchases of this phenomenon as well. First is the protection issue, where people are buying, not just masks, but apparel for protection. And not more usable, clothes and fabrics, but also more scooters, more bicycles, more motorcycles, and now new as well as used cars that have been an important dynamic in the automotive industry, that although it's not the same as the sales level of last year's or of 2019, looking at the sales levels in September, it sees how homes are now demanding more vehicles of this type. And then we close with the cycle of what I call revenge purchasing. And like I told you, since 85,000 years, we've been hunters and gatherers. And the way of being a hunter and gatherer today is buying things. And some things we can't not only buy, which cause anxiety. And one of the cures for all this anxiety we're facing is buying. We've all had a chocolate or a drink or things or go shopping when you are anxious and when you have time to do it. So when in March we had the opening of Sara stores in particular, people over there started going out to buy so much in a single day, where we had the same phenomenon in Colombia in the days we said we could purchase things without VAT tax, which were huge crowds of people. And then we said people could not be on the street, regularly. We have to keep social distancing. So this modification of the demand curve, many say it's because of the virus, but like the presenter so adequately put, it's about the isolation, not the virus. It's because we stayed at home, and we stayed at home temporarily. Not necessarily does our condition change or health condition change, but it's about changing habits and the reflection here. And what might be useful to you is the following message. We are in a type of post-lockdown right now, post-quarantine, however you want to call it, post-isolation. We are not in a post-COVID period. And for insurance industry, that needs to be even a stronger message than for any other industry in our country. If you tell people that we're in a post-COVID period, what people understand is that the virus is over and done with. But the virus is not going to go away. Basically, it's going to stay with humanity for thousands of years, like TB, like typhoid or polio, and so many diseases that we still have to deal with. So this end of isolation, what did it cause? That the expense of households had a dynamic of reallocating that expense entirely, favoring non-durable good purchase, basically food, reducing the semi-durables and durables purchasing, but especially affecting the service industry. So it's not only the modeling that we used to do, but in 7 countries of Latin America that are very representative of the region, we can verify this conclusion, and that frequent purchasing that what we do every month, I mean, your food, pay your utilities, pay your rent, pay health, and pay education. You have a basket in Latin America that accounts for 72 or 73% of expense. And now in lockdown, this reached 80% levels, reducing the sense of well-being in the region in a very significant manner as well. So the big question here is, well, we knew that this would happen. We see that what Camilo is telling us is nothing new to you. But what is the change that will really remain in the market? We know that the food demand grew very significantly during isolation because people that stopped eating outside in restaurants or outside their homes. And let's analyze this logically. Evidently, the situation shows us that homes or a person on the average eats 1 kilogram of food per day in 2 liters per day. About 300 to 400 grams were consumed outside your home. And you saw the fall in the restaurants and the increase in the goods prepared at home increased. And we see an increase in public utilities because the authorities did not expect this, or many institutions did not foresee this. They did not only modifying the expense of homes, but also a series of questions about society as a whole. I mentioned the increase of appliances such as refrigerators and such increasing, and computers, and now automobiles start reactivating their sales again. There is a big change where we will see permanent change here because previously we bought a bottle of alcohol per year, if that, and now we're buying that monthly. And one of the greatest impacts has been suffered by the fashion and apparel industry. So with this growth, we see that we have contraction of consumption effect because they're as a function of what they had prior to the isolation. In the case of Ecuador or Mexico and Peru that had already been decelerating, and Colombia, on the contrary, was accelerating, and we have different levels of affectation. So we expected households to grow, have a growth of 5% this year, and with the isolation measures and the way they took place in Colombia, we've seen how this forecast had to be changed as a function of the new estimation parameters and the new knowledge that we obtained of the model. And what we know today is that the expense of households today dropped about 10 percentage points, which is the biggest contraction in history that we've seen, with a very important note right there. What we measure in radar includes used goods and includes the informal sector. Just as the insurance sector, we somehow measure the purchasing of assets that are used, such as vehicles or homes, where here we see an important spending dynamic. Secondly, the growth of expense finishing last year was very big. We particularly saw growth rates close to 8%. Even that can be compared, when comparing with to this year, is going to be a recovery more in W than in V when we talk about households. And of course, what we see today in the inflation data that are going to maintain pretty similar when they're published by the Danish Statistics Bureau next week. And each city had an entirely different growth level. The small and warmer cities of middle income and lower income somehow are the ones that are growing more in expenditure, considering that the semi-durable and durable goods are being looked or sought after more, where in higher income cities, what we've seen is that the drop of in commercial activity is much higher because households has much more components. That's only the durable goods have a very marked trend. The semi-durable like clothes are presenting a line like this. The durable ones like furniture are looking like this. And insurance in Colombia start having a big challenge. When we look at the food on the other side, it's becoming much more normal compared to last year. And to a given extent, things have to do with house maintenance is increasing, clothes and apparel is improving, service, particularly because of insurance and such, and education is going down, which is a particular concern that we have. You know, there's a high university dropout rates and school dropout rates, about 5 to 15% that are talking in different sectors up to such high levels. Of course, the entertainment and industry affected, and communications and transportation. And now you see how all these sectors are starting to regularize themselves more and more. So what happened to expenditure that is outside of commerce, which is education and health mostly, has been going down, and the purchasing channels have somehow been more benefited. The traditional channels, you know, the marketplace or your mini market, in your neighborhood is becoming benefited, whereas big shopping malls and commercial surfaces have not. So saying that growth at this time is something homogeneous is something that is not the case. It's not worth a relevant saying, but when you have frequent purchasing, which is food and general spending, are getting a green light, which is important. The rest of the market is still in negative terrain, which is very difficult to overcome. These are the expectations that what we're seeing. We're looking at these 60 categories of household expense. How did they fall? How they're growing up again? This is what we call our heat map. And just like you can see in the graphs on the right. So how did this really change expense in households? Here in January, you spend 32 of every 100 pesos in food and 11 pesos in various, which is pretty much personal expenses. February, not many changes. March, food increases, arriving 37% in April. In May, it's reduced a little bit. And now in August, we see how it has somehow, there's a new weighing factor in households, but we can see that we are trying to find the original state and trying to get to what we had in January. So although along the way we learned a bunch of things like payment over the internet and purchasing in virtual channels that some people like and some people don't, evidently the households are reallocating expenditure in a second phase. So in this, basically the summary of the previous graph, all these graphs, so entertainment, fashion, transportation had a big affectation, and categories that quickly captured, the expense of households have lost it again because people will go back to their regular interest and what they like the most. So some people prefer one things and other people prefer other things, which is normal. And something that the superintendent said is going back to the new normal is something that is always taking place, really. At an expense level and consumption level, we would think that we're always doing the same, but that's not true. That is technically changing every day. So having said that, what we see is that a price level, evidently the index or the price index for the Colombian general basket is changing, but is decelerated. But the basket really grew overall, which makes that mother are feeling that inflation is much stronger than what was actually published by our statistics agency. So the capacity of purchasing, if we look at as a function of the policies that we see in Colombia, we can see that for a household that has minimum wage income, for example, policy can be 5%, automobile can be 10 for someone else, and a company could be allocating about 50 or 60% of a monthly minimum wage salary to paying for policies, even for compliance policies and health associated, or to insure its own property. If we take this at a level of per capita salary and not minimum wage salary, the percentages drop a lot. But this is how we see that because of this low penetration that the sector has here, the costs are sufficiently high for there not to be a big incentive to be insured, really, in these areas. We've actually worked with a Fasecolda team for some time now, and this is important to mention. In terms of a consumer confidence, it has been gone down in recent times, but not necessarily because of the isolation in this case, more related to the type of exchange rate. And what I'm putting here is the growth of the dollar, but in negative terms. It's just a mathematical game here. It's like placing the dollar in the opposite direction. It's not 3,000 pesos per dollar, but I put it at minus 3,000 to see how we can affect the behavior of the consumer associated. So we can see how much the dollar is worth on the news. So to bring my mom into this, and every time the dollar is down, my mom feels the economy is okay. And when dollar goes up in value, she feels that the economy is going in the bad direction, which is not necessarily true, as we know. So under that premise, what are we seeing? At the expense of homes in Colombia that behave so differently in March and April and May of this year, even in June, Now in June, July, it starts behaving pretty close to historicals, and we expect that in September, October, November, and December, it has a very similar behavior to what was originally expected. And that leaves us something very important in this conclusion. The dynamic of households that was recovering so slowly is going to come to a halt at the end of the year. And it's going to halt because when comparing it with the very good figures of last year, of course, we're going to be in negative ground. And here's where we see that the household expenditure is going to have this recovery in W that I was mentioning some time ago. So you can see the placement of credit is very low, and the dynamic of the banking collections follows the same direction. So something that we've talked very little about, and I think is worthwhile, is the purchase capacity of salaries in Colombia right now. Although there's 30 to 35% of Colombian households so affected negatively by their income being hit so hard, the people that maintain their salary and their income saw an increase in their salary 5 or 6% this year, and with inflation less than 2%, which gives us an increased purchasing capacity that's pretty important. But that increased capacity is going basically spent on two things: prepayment of debt, that people that have the capacity to prepay their debt and have the capacity to do this, and also buying of households, buying of homes right now, trying to build your bunker and own it, which is the behavior I was talking about. Particularly the central bank reference indexes have gone down, but we have two dynamics to look at: the effective credit used from credit cards that have separated from the limit of these rates, and also the drop in collections. Hence, the sensation of risk that banks are feeling right now. So all this information leaves us to say that besides being isolated, the available income and the capacity of purchasing has been increased, although not in all homes, of course, 30 to 35% of homes being very negatively affected, but the rest has a very big purchasing capacity. And we start seeing an important movement in the commercial markets, where we see in general consumption of goods that will now go back on September and October, because you have to pay the installments for the credit that you used in the past 2 months. So when we look at the behavior of households every day after you use your stocked up your bunker, now the dynamic of expense going back to September and October, especially the technological capacity to analyze this data, and I'm sure you have this in the insurance sector, I think is letting us understand how in households in different cities, dynamics are so different, not just because of their purchase capacity, but because of their different restrictions during the lockdown and very different situations in different places. And curfews or not and such, and 35% of transactions were only market associated, where we're almost at the same level of transactions today that we had a year ago before lockdown. About 85 or 86% of transactions in households are dealing with market elements. So households are not just buying these non-durables, but also buying durable elements, semi-durables, and even now some more and more services, which evidently is a positive sign of what's happening, and to evidence how that change in channels that we initially mentioned, going back to the traditional channel, is once again becoming very similar to what we saw last year. So where is the change? Besides the change, so one thing is, and the consumers are the ones clearly using these products besides the channel. So if you had 1 more hour a day, which is very, if I ask you, what would you dedicate more time to dedicate my time for my family or to sleep more? But if I took an hour of your day, what would you do? And today, if you feel an hour was taken from you, or actually you had 1 more hour because you don't have to go to the bus and to work. But besides, you don't spend that hour to spend with your family, you actually spend it working 1 more hour. So from the point of view of insurance, you need to think, how much are we consuming? People think that they only consume 24 hours a day, where they're really 8 hours in a computer, 10 hours in a desk, 18 hours with your mobile phone, and almost 23 hours you're dressed. So in only 4 categories, we consume about 58 hours. So in the real time, household spends about 6 hours of consumption per day if you add all the products and services that you're consuming every day. And here the consumption dynamic was also affected. Clearly, we consume more clothes in this time, more education, and more entertainment, but we didn't pay for it, which is what I was mentioning a while ago. Looking at these two sides of the coin of the purchaser and the consumer, then we realize an important change taking place because we're spending more and more time in our house and we need to reaccommodate our homes, reconquer our homes. And that implies understanding several things taking place. The most recent data tells us that effectively, takeout purchasing has increased so much, but now it's decelerating as people are starting to go out and physically purchase their food. Same as goes for internet transactions, especially in e-commerce. I don't mean financial transactions or payments online. So, or the back office from the banking sector, where evidently we're seeing going back to physical interaction somehow. So in this sense, we went from playing hide and seek to play tag, from being isolated to go to the street back again, because there's less purchase missions and more order missions. So even though many processes were accelerated during the pandemic, this will not remain in the long term. But now we have new news, which is legal news, where companies go from living in a world of messages to a world of messengers, and evidently leaving under the responsibility and accountability of a messenger is not only a legal problem, but a very significant marketing issue. So like the superintendent says, we're living a very important virtual scenario where the conversion rates and effectiveness rates of physical portals or virtual portals have enabled many companies to engage in recovery. But if you expect the same consumption dynamic that we've seen in households, what we're really expecting is a very hard Christmas. And here's an end of the year, and what I want is to propose the following reflection for your sector. December celebrations start with winter solstice in the Mediterranean world, and then we go to the Catholic Nativity, and Christmas as we understand it from the Charles Dickens, the Scrooge, and that goes from present, past, and future, and now the modern Christmas. Today we don't know how Christmas might look like. It might be like this or like this, but we have the historical advantage of redefining Christmas that we didn't have before, and not only engaging in new traditions, but new levels of satisfaction in households and for people, thinking of the opportunities that the market provides us with that is unique in our history. So this per capita expense of households that took so long to recover after the mortgage crisis, and less in the financial crisis, and perhaps less when commodities prices went down internationally, gives us interesting lessons learned to say that institutions and companies and insurers and households have already lived through these crises and have been able to prepare for the situation we have right now. So we're not only in a recession, we're also in an acceleration period. And that acceleration is taking us for homes to ask for things to be good, cheap, and good. And that you want them to be close by, good, and readily available. And that's the new scenario that we need to provide for households right now, where the superintendent very well puts it. We go from a go-to-market where people need to go and buy an insurance policy, and now the policies need to go and reach people. So this new dynamic is going to redefine things specifically for you. Here's my contact info if you want to reach me somehow, or contact Radar, or I can give you the presentation if you need it for your guild to have it. And I want to close with 2 slides that are nice. First one, talking about my concern that the employment is not recovered on time and the subsidies and aids are removed before that. I think that Danny, gives us a little bit of peace of mind with our latest surveys. And then talking about insurance and people moving towards informality is a good conclusion. And then that the per capita income and the consumption levels of households will take about 3 years to recover. So this is what we've seen that happened to spending in home and what can happen in 2021. Thank you so much. Thank you, Camilo, for your intervention and consumer point of view. If you let me, we have several questions here of the over 300 people that are connected here to our transmission and this new reality, thinking of this new risk and these new situations that present new challenges for the sector. So there's a question that I would like to ask you for you to talk about this. At Mendes is asking, depending on the analysis of radar, will the is there going to be a reallocation that is continuous in this changed way for next year, or do we expect to go back to the behavior before pandemic? You talk about at least 2 years in this transition phase.
When we look at the total market, we fall in the trap to say that all households buy vehicles every month. Of course, this doesn't happen, and that households in January and February spend the same as they do in October and November, which doesn't happen either. So all of the months, the structure of expenses change. Even though there are things that would seem to adjust and that remain over time, what we have seen is that there are three baskets that will definitely change a lot. One has to do with cleanliness and household cleanliness, health and insurance that is also increasing within the expenditure of homes and households, especially in health, and third, in deliveries or takeouts. And what is actually happening is that the deliveries that we have done have a cost to them, and this goes in to displace other expenses at homes. So what we see is that initially in the recovery that is taking place, the structure of expenses will have an adjustment in all three fronts. But we have to also understand and be fully aware of this, that the expense or the purchasing power in the totality of the market, because there's a 35% that is affected, will be reduced. So per capita expense will be lesser in 2020 and 2021 than when compared to 2019. We will see these expenses per capita similar to those of 2019 in value only until 22, most likely, but with an expense that is different, not only because of the changes that we're having, but because of the entrance of new systematic players in the market. So every 5 years, people wouldn't buy Netflix 5 years ago, and 20 years ago they wouldn't buy cell phones. And most likely with the new medications that will emerge to prepare the body better and to have the treatments in case of getting this disease, well, the expenses in health will change with these new medicines in 2021 and possibly in 2022. Another question. Which will be the categories of assets or goods or services that at the end of this situation of pandemic will be the most punished and most successful, is asked by at Molina from Cali. Well, this will depend in the moment. During isolation, the entertainment industry will be affected the most in terms of movies and restaurants, bars. This has a huge affectation as it happens with fashion. So dress purchasing and all that has been affected. But once the opening takes place, and we have new regulations of behavior that we can have to once again be in that world of entertainment again. At the end of isolation, well, the winners will be that entertainment industry, because people will want to go back to have these new spaces and feelings, and the fashion industry will also have these dynamics. In the same sense, the food industry and it will have an interesting dynamics in these months of isolation, but once again, the openings start to take place, and once happens, these will be stopped. And at the beginning, those would seem to be winners. Well, this will be a temporary gain, and then they will seem losers in the following months. So this new reality, these new risks, and everything that we have suffered in all the sectors of the economy and from the consumer standpoint, will the consumer go towards a type of insurance? Do you think there will be a field of action? Well, I would say that if we stay with the offer of value that we have in the marketplace, well, there could be a growth in terms of vehicle insurance, because there will be a dynamic of buying of cars and technologies and computers, cell phones, and within the value offer, there could be a change in the dynamic. If the insurance sector takes advantage of the opportunity so that this is not just an increase in insurance policies, which is what we're seeing, They will launch a line of products or services or insurance to the new conditions needed by the market right now. Well, most likely there will be a growth. But if the insurance sector doesn't launch it, maybe another player in the world of fintech will take advantage of this opportunity in the market. So in one way or another, here we see many new conditions in the market, and we can see it from the negative side, but we can also see it from the positive side in terms of the creation of new opportunities of value for the consumer. Where do you see those new opportunities of value? What are the needs of insurance that one could start to cultivate, to put it in a way, after this pandemic? People feel uninsured in what aspects? Is it in employment and, of course, health, maybe? Well, I think that there are several topics. A very important one has to do with the household. Households, in a surprising fashion, has been an indicator that I didn't want to delve in because of the time I had allotted. There has been an increase in remodeling, refurbishing, and this cost is because these refurbishings have two origins. One, to realize that we live in a hotel and not a home, and this requires modifications. And second of all, things have started to happen at home. If you use the water system at home because you have to wash more dishes, or have to use the toilets because the toilets and the bathrooms all end up being the health system in the families, there has also been important ruptures there. I think the insurance sector has an important opportunity there, and the market is requesting this system of insurance before accidents at home should be much steeper, as it is definitely being offered already. What's more, some retail stores are offering this in the Colombian market. Second, there is a very interesting opportunity in terms of vehicles, and it is that many vehicles remained parked for a while, and this, of course, makes them being affected. And in the insurance company or the dealerships or in the brands took advantage of this opportunity. And this could generate a new line of insurance around not just the mechanic of vehicles, but also the outfitting and servicing of new isolations in new cities in case there is a new wave of contagion that cannot be handled by the healthcare system. And third of all, there is a very important issue, as mentioned in the world of technology, where the continuous use of online tools allow for households to need and feel much safer in not only in terms of transactions, but social media. What's more, everything dealing with hacking to the provision of digital services, where unfortunately the market has a very small offer of value in these types of digital services. Yes, indeed, we see many needs that we have to start thinking about to seek new solutions to. There's another question, and this one is not so much as towards the future, but towards what happened with the days without tax in consumption, and what is expected for the third day without tax. Well, the first day without tax handled a lot of anxiety, because if you're closed and if you're allowed to go and buy things, well, you will do so. And one of the things that we have to understand from this and accept and understand is that when we are buyers, we are not as rational. We're not the economic agents that where we minimize this and maximize profits. No, we are pushed by our desires. So when we looked at the purchases that took place in the first day without tax, well, TV sets moved a lot, let's say. So this was something that was made fun of because of the lack of rationale. Households wanted to have a better entertainment system with better connectivity to internet, knowing that they were going to be isolated longer. So imagine that you didn't have your computer right now, and you're having this conference that we are all in, and that you don't have a TV where you can see all the movies, or where your children can watch movies to entertain themselves during this. So TV sets, beyond watching news, ended up being the main entertainment expense. The second wave of tax allowed us to make more purchases where computers, refrigerators, and others had important dynamics. We are waiting for or expecting the third day without tax. We haven't defined if the date is going to be in October or November, or the dynamics are going to have a different condition because the market is open and there's not going to be this anxiety. But in the two previous days, aimed at showed the great issue there is in terms of digital transactions and that insecurity there is where to have a clear option for the consumer, and this which could generate dynamics that are completely different. Well, thank you very much, Camilo Herrera from the Radar firm, to open up this window to the world of the consumer, to what they feel, to what they think, to what they need, especially as to how the insurance industry can get closer every day, especially in this situation, and to those who are finally our interest, that is the consumers, the citizens, the population in general in Colombia. So thanks very much for your ideas, for your lessons here. So they are of great help for us. Thank you.